Book 2, Chapter 23 of Resurrection. When Nechludov knew Selenin as a student, he was a good son, a true friend, and for his years an educated man of the world with much tact, elegant, handsome, and at the same time truthful and honest. He learned well, without much exertion and with no pedantry, receiving gold medals for his essays. He considered the service of mankind, not only in words but in acts, to be the aim of his young life. He saw no other way of being useful to humanity than by serving the state. Therefore, as soon as he had completed his studies, he systematically examined all the activities to which he might devote his life, and decided to enter the second department of the Chancellery, where the laws are drawn up, and he did so. But in spite of the most scrupulous and exact discharge of the duties demanded of him, this service gave no satisfaction to his desire of being useful, nor could he awake in himself the consciousness that he was doing the right thing. This dissatisfaction was so much increased by the friction with his very small-minded and vain fellow officials that he left the Chancellery and entered the Senate. It was better there, but the same dissatisfaction still pursued him. He felt it to be very different from what he had expected and from what ought to be. And now that he was in the Senate, his relatives obtained for him the post of Gentleman of the Bedchamber, and he had to go in a carriage, dressed in an embroidered uniform and a white linen apron, to thank all sorts of people for having placed him in the position of a lackey. However much he tried, he could find no reasonable explanation for the existence of this post, and felt, more than in the Senate, that it was not the right thing. And yet he could not refuse it for fear of hurting those who felt sure they were giving him much pleasure by this appointment, and because it flattered the lowest part of his nature. It pleased him to see himself in a mirror in his gold-embroidered uniform, and to accept the deference paid him by some people because of his position. Something of the same kind happened when he was married. A very brilliant match from a worldly point of view was arranged for him, and he married chiefly because by refusing he would have had to hurt the young lady who wished to be married to him, and those who arranged the marriage, and also because a marriage with a nice young girl of noble birth flattered his vanity and gave him pleasure. But this marriage very soon proved to be even less the right thing than the government service and his position at court. After the birth of her first child, the wife decided to have no more, and began leading that luxurious worldly life in which he now had to participate, whether he liked or not. She was not particularly handsome, and was faithful to him, and she seemed, in spite of all the efforts it cost her, to derive nothing but weariness from the life she led. Yet she perseveringly continued to live it, though it was poisoning her husband's life. And all his efforts to alter this life were shattered, as against a stone wall, by her conviction, which all her friends and relatives supported, that all was as it should be. The child, a little girl with bare legs and long golden curls, was a being perfectly foreign to him, chiefly because she was trained quite otherwise than he wished her to be. There sprung up between the husband and wife the usual misunderstanding, without even the wish to understand each other, and then a silent warfare, hidden from outsiders and tempered by decorum. All this made his life at home a burden, and became even less the right thing than his service and his post. But it was above all his attitude towards religion which was not the right thing. Like every one of his set and his time, by the growth of his reason, he broke without the least effort the nets of the religious superstitions in which he was brought up, and did not himself exactly know when it was that he freed himself of them. Being earnest and upright, he did not, during his youth and intimacy with Nechludov as a student, conceal his rejection of the state religion. But as years went on and he rose in the service, and especially at the time of the reaction towards conservatism in society, his spiritual freedom stood in his way. At home, when his father died, he had to be present at the masses said for his soul, and his mother wished him to go to confession or to communion, and it was in a way expected by public opinion, but above all government service demanded that he should be present at all sorts of services, consecrations, thanksgivings, and the like. Hardly a day passed without some outward religious form having to be observed. When present at these services he had to pretend that he believed in something which he did not believe in, and being truthful he could not do this. The alternative was, having made up his mind that all these outward signs were deceitful, to alter his life in such a way that he would not have to be present at such ceremonials. But to do what seemed so simple would have cost a great deal. Besides encountering the perpetual hostility of all those who were near to him, he would have to give up the service and his position, and sacrifice his hopes of being useful to humanity by his service now and in the future. To make such a sacrifice, one would have to be firmly convinced of being right. And he was firmly convinced he was right, as no educated man of our time can help being convinced who knows little history and how the religions, and especially Church Christianity, originated. But under the stress of his daily life, he, a truthful man, allowed a little falsehood to creep in. He said that in order to do justice to an unreasonable thing, one had to study the unreasonable thing. It was a little falsehood, but it sunk him into the big falsehood in which he was now caught. Before putting to himself the question whether the orthodoxy in which he was born and bred, and which everyone expected him to accept, and without which he could not continue his useful occupation, contained the truth, he had already decided the answer. And to clear up the question, he did not read Voltaire, Schopenhauer, Herbert Spencer, or Comte, but the philosophical works of Hegel, and the religious works of Vinet and Khomyakov, and naturally found in them what he wanted, i.e., something like peace of mind and a vindication of that religious teaching in which he was educated, which his reason had long ceased to accept, but without which his whole life was filled with unpleasantness, which could all be removed by accepting the teaching. And so he adopted all the usual sophistries which go to prove that a single human reason cannot know the truth, that the truth is only revealed to an association of men, and can only be known by revelation, that revelation is kept by the Church, etc. And so he managed to be present at prayers, masses for the dead, to confess, make signs of the cross in front of icons, with a quiet mind, without being conscious of the lie, and to continue in the service which gave him the feeling of being useful, and some comfort in his joyless family life. Although he believed this, he felt with his entire being that this religion of his, more than all else, was not the right thing, and that is why his eyes always looked sad. And seeing Nechludov, whom he had known before all these lies had rooted themselves within him, reminded him of what he then was. It was especially after he had hurried to hint at his religious views that he had most strongly felt all this not the right thing, and had become painfully sad. Nechludov felt it also after the first joy of meeting his old friend had passed, and therefore, though they promised each other to meet, they did not take any steps towards an interview, and did not again see each other during the stay of Nechludov's in Petersburg. End of Book 2, Chapter 23. Book 2, Chapter 24 of Resurrection. When they left the Senate, Nechludov and the advocate walked on together, the advocate having given the driver of his carriage orders to follow them. The advocate told Nechludov the story of the chief of a government department about whom the senators had been talking, how the thing was found out, and how the man who, according to law, should have been sent to the mines, had been appointed governor of a town in Siberia. Then he related with particular pleasure how several high-placed persons stole a lot of money collected for the erection of the still unfinished monument which they had passed that morning. Also how the mistress of so-and-so got a lot of money at the stock exchange, and how so-and-so agreed with so-and-so to sell him his wife. The advocate began another story about a swindle and all sorts of crimes committed by persons in high places, who, instead of being in prison, sat on presidential chairs in all sorts of government institutions. These tales, of which the advocate seemed to have an unending supply, gave him much pleasure, showing as they did with perfect clearness that his means of getting money were quite just and innocent compared to the means which the highest officials in Petersburg made use of. The advocate was therefore surprised when Nechludov took an isvostchik before hearing the end of the story, said good-bye, and left him. Nechludov felt very sad. It was chiefly the rejection of the appeal by the Senate, confirming the senseless torments that the innocent Maslova was enduring, that saddened him, and also the fact that this rejection made it still harder for him to unite his fate with hers. The stories about existing evils, which the advocate recounted with such relish, heightened his sadness, and so did the cold, unkind look that the once sweet-natured, frank, noble Selenin had given him, and which kept recurring to his mind. On his return the doorkeeper handed him a note, and said, rather scornfully, that some kind of woman had written it in the hall. It was a note from Shostova's mother. She wrote that she had come to thank her daughter's benefactor and saviour, and to implore him to come to see them on the Vassilyevsky, 5th line, house number . This was very necessary because of Vera Doukhova. He need not be afraid that they would weary him with expressions of gratitude. They would not speak their gratitude, but be simply glad to see him. Would he not come next morning, if he could? There was another note from Bogotyrev, a former fellow officer, aide-de-camp to the Emperor, whom Nechludov had asked to hand personally to the Emperor his petition on behalf of the sectarians. Bogotyrev wrote in his large, firm hand that he would put the petition into the Emperor's own hands as he had promised, but that it had occurred to him that it might be better for Nechludov first to go and see the person on whom the matter depended. After the impressions received during the last few days, Nechludov felt perfectly hopeless of getting anything done. The plans he had formed in Moscow seemed now something like the dreams of youth, which are inevitably followed by disillusion when life comes to be faced. Still, being now in Petersburg, he considered it his duty to do all he had intended, and he resolved next day, after consulting Bogotyrev, to act on his advice and see the person on whom the case of the sectarians depended. He got out the sectarians' petition from his portfolio and began reading it over, when there was a knock at his door and a footman came in with a message from the Countess Katerina Ivanovna, who asked him to come up and have a cup of tea with her. Nechludov said he would come at once, and having put the papers back into the portfolio, he went up to his aunt's. He looked out of a window on his way and saw Mariette's pair of bays standing in front of the house, and he suddenly brightened and felt inclined to smile. Mariette, with a hat on her head, not in black, but with a light dress of many shades, sat with a cup in her hand beside the Countess's easy-chair, prattling about something, while her beautiful, laughing eyes glistened. She had said something funny, something indecently funny, just as Nechludov entered the room. He knew it by the way she laughed, and by the way the good-natured Countess Katerina Ivanovna's fat body was shaking with laughter, while Mariette, her smiling mouth slightly drawn to one side, her head a little bent, a peculiarly mischievous expression in her merry, energetic face, sat silently looking at her companion. From a few words which he overheard, Nechludov guessed that they were talking of the second piece of Petersburg news, the episode of the Siberian governor, and that it was in reference to this subject that Mariette had said something so funny that the Countess could not control herself for a long time. "You will kill me," she said, coughing. After saying "How do you do?" Nekhludoff sat down. He was about to censure Mariette in his mind for her levity, when, noticing the serious and even slightly dissatisfied look in his eyes, she suddenly, to please him, changed not only the expression of her face, but also the attitude of her mind. For she felt the wish to please him as soon as she looked at him. She suddenly turned serious, dissatisfied with her life, as if seeking and striving after something. It was not that she pretended, but she really reproduced in herself the very same state of mind that he was in, although it would have been impossible for her to express in words what was the state of Nekhludoff's mind at that moment. She asked him how he had accomplished his tasks. He told her about his failure in the Senate and his meeting Selenin. "Oh, what a pure soul! He is indeed a chevalier sans peur et sans reproche." "A pure soul," said both ladies, using the epithet commonly applied to Selenin in Petersburg society. "What is his wife like?" Nekhludoff asked. "His wife? Well, I do not wish to judge, but she does not understand him." "Is it possible that he, too, was for rejecting the appeal?" Mariette asked, with real sympathy. "It is dreadful. How sorry I am for her," she added, with a sigh. He frowned, and in order to change the subject, began to speak about Shoustova, who had been imprisoned in the fortress and was now set free through the influence of Mariette's husband. He thanked her for her trouble, and was going on to say how dreadful he thought it that this woman and the whole of her family had suffered merely because no one had reminded the authorities about them. But Mariette interrupted him and expressed her own indignation. "Say nothing about it to me," she said. "When my husband told me she could be set free, it was this that struck me. What was she kept in prison for if she is innocent?" She went on expressing what Nekhludoff was about to say. "It is revolting, revolting." Countess Katerina Ivanovna noticed that Mariette was coquetting with her nephew, and this amused her. "What do you think?" she said, when they were silent. "Supposing you come to Aline's tomorrow night. Kiesewetter will be there. And you too," she said, turning to Mariette. "Il vous a remarque," she went on to her nephew. "He told me that what you say, I repeated it all to him, is a very good sign, and that you will certainly come to Christ. You must come absolutely. Tell him to, Mariette, and come yourself." "Countess, in the first place, I have no right whatever to give any kind of advice to the Prince," said Mariette, and gave Nekhludoff a look that somehow established a full comprehension between them of their attitude in relation to the Countess's words and evangelicism in general. "Secondly, I do not much care, you know." "Yes, I know you always do things the wrong way round, and according to your own ideas." "My own ideas? I have faith, like the most simple peasant woman," said Mariette with a smile. "And thirdly, I am going to the French theatre tomorrow night." "Ah, and have you seen that what's her name?" asked Countess Katerina Ivanovna. Mariette gave the name of a celebrated French actress. "You must go, most decidedly. She is wonderful." "Whom am I to see first, ma tante? The actress or the preacher?" Nekhludoff said with a smile. "Please don't catch at my words." "I should think the preacher first, and then the actress, or else the desire for the sermon might vanish altogether," said Nekhludoff. "No, better begin with the French theatre, and do penance afterwards. Now then, you are not to hold me up for ridicule. The preacher is the preacher, and the theatre is the theatre. One need not weep in order to be saved. One must have faith, and then one is sure to be gay." "You, ma tante, preach better than any preacher." "Do you know what?" said Mariette. "Come into my box tomorrow." "I am afraid I shall not be able to." The footman interrupted the conversation by announcing a visitor. It was the secretary of a philanthropic society of which the Countess was president. "Oh, that is the dullest of men. I think I shall receive him out there, and return to you later on. Mariette, give him his tea." said the Countess, and left the room with her quick, wriggling walk. Mariette took the glove off her firm, rather flat hand, the fourth finger of which was covered with rings. "Want any?" she said, taking hold of the silver teapot, under which a spirit lamp was burning, and extending her little finger curiously. Her face looked sad and serious. "It is always terribly painful to me to notice that people whose opinion I value confound me with the position I am placed in." She seemed ready to cry as she said these last words, and though these words had no meaning, or at any rate a very indefinite meaning, they seemed to be of exceptional depth, meaning, or goodness to Nekhludoff, so much was he attracted by the look of the bright eyes which accompanied the words of this young, beautiful, and well-dressed woman. Nekhludoff looked at her in silence and could not take his eyes from her face. "You think I do not understand, you and all that goes on in you? Why, everybody knows what you are doing. C'est le secret de Polichinelle. And I am delighted with your work and think highly of you. Really, there is nothing to be delighted with, and I have done so little as yet. No matter, I understand your feelings, and I understand her. All right, I will say nothing more about it," she said, noticing displeasure on his face. "But I also understand that after seeing all the suffering and the horror in the prisons," Mariette went on, her only desire that of attracting him, and guessing with her woman's instinct what was dear and important to him, "you wish to help the sufferers, those who are made to suffer so terribly by other men, and their cruelty and indifference. I understand the willingness to give one's life, and could give mine in such a cause, but we each have our own fate. Are you then dissatisfied with your fate?" "I?" she asked, as if struck with surprise that such a question could be put to her. "I have to be satisfied, and am satisfied. But there is a worm that wakes up, and he must not be allowed to fall asleep again. It is a voice that must be obeyed," Nekhludoff said, falling into the trap. Many a time later on, Nekhludoff remembered with shame his talk with her. He remembered her words, which were not so much lies as imitations of his own, and her face, which seemed looking at him with sympathetic attention when he told her about the terrors of the prison and of his impressions in the country. When the Countess returned they were talking not merely like old, but like exclusive friends who alone understood one another. They were talking about the injustice of power, of the sufferings of the unfortunate, the poverty of the people. Yet in reality, in the midst of the sound of their talk, their eyes, gazing at each other, kept asking, "Can you love me?" and answering, "I can," and the sex feeling, taking the most unexpected and brightest forms, drew them to each other. As she was going away, she told him she would always be willing to serve him in any way she could, and asked him to come and see her, if only for a moment, in the theatre next day, as she had a very important thing to tell him about. "Yes, and when shall I see you again?" she added with a sigh, carefully drawing the glove over her jewelled hand. "Say you will come." Nekhludoff promised. That night, when Nekhludoff was alone in his room and lay down after putting out his candle, he could not sleep. He thought of Maslova, of the decision of the Senate, of his resolve to follow her in any case, of his having given up the land. The face of Mariette appeared to him as if in answer to those thoughts. Her look, her sigh, her words, "When shall I see you again?" and her smile seemed vivid, as if he really saw her, and he also smiled. "Shall I be doing right in going to Siberia, and have I done right in divesting myself of my wealth?" And the answers to the questions on this Petersburg night, on which the daylight streamed into the window from under the blind, were quite indefinite. All seemed mixed in his head. He recalled his former state of mind and the former sequence of his thoughts, but they had no longer their former power or validity. And supposing I have invented all this, and am unable to live it through? Supposing I repent of having acted right, he thought, and unable to answer, he was seized with such anguish and despair as he had long not felt. Unable to free himself from this perplexity, he fell into a heavy sleep, such as he had slept after a heavy loss at cards. End of Book 2, Chapter 24.